Seen in movies, no dramatic iron bars or echoing corridors, just beige concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, and the persistent smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with human desperation. Karen sat on the narrow bench, still wearing her damp swimsuit beneath the oversized orange jumpsuit they'd given her, staring at her manicured hands as if they belonged to someone else. 6 hours. That's how long she'd been here. 6 hours since Officer Rodriguez had read her rights in her own backyard while neighbors gathered at their windows, phones out, recording everything. 6 hours since her perfect world had imploded with the efficiency of a controlled demolition. The charges were more serious than she'd imagined. Reckless endangerment of a minor, criminal conspiracy, intent to file false reports. And that was just the beginning. Rodriguez had mentioned that the district attorney was considering additional charges once they finished their investigation. The investigation, Karen closed her eyes and tried not to think about what they might find. The weakened fence boards, the security cameras that several neighbors had installed over the past year. Cameras that might have captured her sabotaging the fence. The phone records that would show her increasingly desperate calls to the Homeowners Association, the city council, anyone who might help her get rid of the Henderson family, and Miguel. God, Miguel knew everything. Mrs. Whitmore, a young public defender, stood outside the cell, briefcase in hand and exhaustion written across his face. "I'm David Chen. I've been assigned to your case." Karen looked up, taking in his cheap suit and earnest expression. This was her lawyer, this boy, who looked like he'd graduated law school last week. "I want a real attorney," she said. "I am a real attorney, Mrs. Whitmore, and unless you can afford to pay retainer fees in the 6-figure range, I'm probably your best option right now." Chen unlocked the cell and gestured for her to follow him. "We need to talk." The interview room was even more depressing than the cellar gray box with a metal table and 2 uncomfortable chairs. Chen spread several files across the surface, and Karen caught glimpses of police reports, witness statements, and photographs that made her stomach lurch. "Okay," Chen said, settling into his chair. "I'm going to be straight with you. This is bad, very bad. The prosecution has security footage from 3 different neighbors showing you damaging the fence over the past month. They have phone records showing your calls to Miguel Santos, including one made 90 minutes before the incident. And they have the text message where he explicitly offers to file false reports with Child Protective Services on your behalf." Karen felt the blood drain from her face. Miguel wouldn't. Miguel is cooperating fully with the investigation in exchange for immunity. Smart man, he knows which way the wind is blowing. Chen pulled out a photograph that made Karen's breath catch. It was a still frame from someone's security camera showing her kneeling by the fence with a knife in her hand. This was taken last Tuesday at 6:47 a.m. "Want to explain what you were doing?" "I was ... The wood was splintered. I was trying to smooth it down with a kitchen knife." Karen stared at the photograph, seeing herself through the eyes of a jury. The image was damning a woman in expensive workout clothes, deliberately weakening a fence that separated her property from a family with a disabled child. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to understand something. The prosecution isn't just going after you for what happened today. They're building a case that you deliberately created a dangerous situation with the intent to harm the Henderson family. That's not just reckless endangerment, that's attempted murder." The words hit Karen like a physical blow. "I saved him. I pulled Tommy out of the pool. How can they charge me with attempted murder when I saved his life? Because they have evidence suggesting you hesitated. The timeline doesn't add up. Tommy was in the water for nearly 3 minutes before you acted. Rex the dog broke through the fence because he heard the child in distress. Distress that had been going on long enough for a dog to process the situation, escape from the Henderson house, and break through a fence to mount a rescue." Chen leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Whitmore, why did you wait so long to save him?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Karen opened her mouth to lie, to spin another story about being frozen with shock or running inside to call for help. But something in Chun's eyes stopped her not judgment. Exactly, but a weary understanding that seemed older than his years. "I wanted him gone," she whispered. Chen nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. The Henderson family, the noise, the chaos. "Do you understand what it's like to work your entire life to build something perfect, only to have it destroyed by People who don't appreciate what they have, Tommy screams. He runs around the yard at all hours. That dog barks constantly. Sarah Henderson hangs laundry on a line like we're living in some trailer park. Karen's voice rose with each word, the familiar indignation flooding back. I spent $2 million on that house. $2 million. And they moved in with their problems and their drama and ruined everything. So you decided to ruin them back. I decided to encourage them to find somewhere more suitable for their ... situation. Chen made a note on his legal pad. By sabotaging the fence and hoping Tommy would wander onto your property, I never intended for him to get hurt. Did you intend? Karen was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I thought, if he trespassed, if something happened on my property, they'd be liable. Insurance would get involved. There would be investigations, lawyers, stress. Eventually, they'd realize they couldn't afford to stay in the neighborhood. And when Tommy fell in your pool, I panicked for 3 minutes. Karen closed her eyes, remembering that eternal moment when she'd stood at her sliding door, watching a 6-year-old child drown in her pool, remembering the calculations that had run through her mind, the liability issues, the insurance implications, the possibility that this was exactly what she'd been hoping for. I thought about letting him die, she admitted. Chen's pen stopped. Moving, for maybe 10 seconds. I thought about letting him drown. I thought about how it would solve all my problems, how the Hendersons would move away and leave me in peace. The words tasted like poison in her mouth, but I couldn't do it. I'm not a murderer. No, Chen said quietly, but you almost were. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Rodriguez entered, his expression grim. Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a development you need to know about. He placed a tablet on the table, showing a news website. The headline made Karen's blood turn to ice. Wealthy Scottsdale woman arrested for attempted murder of autistic child. Below, it was a photograph of Karen being led away in handcuffs, her face twisted with rage as she shouted at the cameras. She didn't remember shouting. She didn't remember the cameras. But there she was, looking every inch the entitled villain the media would make her out to be. It gets worse, Rodriguez said, scrolling down to show a video. Sarah Henderson held a press conference an hour ago. Karen watched in horror as Tommy's mother appeared on screen, the boy himself sitting beside her, Rex lying protectively at their feet. Sarah looked directly into the camera, her voice steady despite the tears running down her cheeks. I want people to understand what kind of person we're dealing with, Sarah said. Karen Whitmore didn't just endanger my son's life. She's been waging a campaign of harassment against our family for months. Anonymous complaints, threats, attempts to have Tommy removed from our home. All because she couldn't stand the sound of an autistic child playing in his own backyard. The video cut to Tommy himself, his innocent voice carrying clearly through the tablet speakers. The nice lady saved me from the water, but she wasn't nice before. She used to watch me through the fence and make angry faces. She scared me. Karen felt something die inside her chest. The child had known, despite his autism, despite his young age, Tommy Henderson had understood exactly what kind of person she was. There's more, Rodriguez continued, his voice professionally neutral but his eyes holding a glint of satisfaction. The story's gone viral. #JusticeForTommy is trending on social media, and we've had 17 more neighbors come forward with complaints about your behavior, harassment, threats, property damage. The DA is considering upgrading the charges to include hate crimes. Karen's voice cracked, targeting a family because of their child's disability. It's a federal offense, Mrs. Whitmore. You're looking at potential prison time measured in decades, not years. Karen stared at the tablet screen, where her own face had been replaced by photos of Tommy Henderson playing in his backyard, laughing. With Rex hugging his mother, he looked like what he was, an innocent child whose only crime was being born different, and she had tried to destroy him. I need to make a deal, she whispered. Chen shook his head. Mrs. Whitmore, after everything that's come out, I'm not sure the DA will be interested in any deals. You've become the most hated woman in America. As if to emphasize his point, they could hear chanting from outside the building. Karen couldn't make out the words, but the anger was unmistakable. Rodriguez stood to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Mrs. Whitmore. You might want to know the community has rallied around The afternoon sun blazed overhead as Karen floated serenely in her pristine pool, champagne flute in hand, believing she owned the world. She had no idea that in 20 seconds, a 90-pound German Shepherd would come crashing through her perfectly, manicured hedge-knot to attack her, but to save a life she was about to destroy. What happened next would expose the darkest secret Karen had been hiding, turn her entire neighborhood against her, and prove that sometimes karma the water was exactly 78 degrees, just the way Karen Whitmore liked it. She adjusted, letting the bubbles dance on her tongue as she floated on her custom-made pool lounger. The Italian limestone surrounding her kidney-shaped pool gleamed white-hot under the Arizona sun, matching perfectly with the Mediterranean-style mansion that loomed behind her like a monument to her success. Perfection, she murmured to herself, a satisfied smile playing across her Botoxed lips. Karen had spent 3 years and $2 million transforming this backyard into her personal oasis. Every blade of grass in the surrounding lawn was precisely measured. Every flower in the meticulously arranged beds had been handpicked by a landscaper who charged more per hour than most people made in a day. The infinity pool seemed to blend seamlessly with the desert horizon, creating an illusion that she was floating in the sky itself. This was her kingdom, and she was its unchallenged queen. The tranquility shattered with the sound of a child's laughter echoing from beyond the 8-foot privacy fence that surrounded her property. Karen's jaw clenched. She pressed the button on her waterproof phone. "Miguel," she barked when her landscaper answered. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. The Hendersons are at it again. Their brat is making noise. I thought we discussed this." Miguel's voice carried a note of weary resignation. "Mrs. Whitmore, children playing in their own backyard isn't something I can find away," Karen cut him off. "I pay you enough. Make it happen." She ended the call and took another sip of champagne, but the taste had turned bitter. The Hendersons had moved in 6 months ago, and they'd been nothing but trouble ever since. Their 6-year-old son, Tommy, had special needs autism, she thought, though she'd never bothered to learn the specifics. What she did know was that he was loud, unpredictable, and constantly disrupting her peace. The child's laughter grew louder, accompanied now by the excited barking of a dog. Karen's grip tightened on her champagne flute. "Goddamn animals," she muttered. She'd already filed 3 noise complaints with the Homeowners Association. She'd sent certified letters. She'd even confronted Sarah Henderson directly at the mailbox, making it crystal clear that their family didn't belong in this neighborhood. But they refused to take the hint. Today, that was going to change. Karen paddled her lounger to the pool's edge and climbed out, water cascading from her surgically enhanced figure. She wrapped herself in an Egyptian cotton towel and stalked across the limestone toward the fence, her bare feet slapping against the scorching stone. The Hendersons' backyard was visible through a gap in the wooden slats gap that Karen had secretly widened with a knife over the past several weeks. Telling herself she needed to monitor the security threat next door, through the opening she could see Tommy Henderson sitting in a small inflatable pool, splashing happily, while his mother, Sarah, sat nearby in a lawn chair reading a book. Their German Shepherd, Rex, was lying in the shade of an old oak tree, panting heavily in the heat. Sarah looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore a faded t-shirt and cut-off shorts that had seen better days. The contrast between her modest backyard and Karen's million-dollar paradise couldn't have been starker. Karen felt a surge of vindictive satisfaction. Some people were born to struggle, she thought. It wasn't her fault they couldn't afford a house in a better neighborhood. She was about to turn away when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Tommy Henderson was climbing out of his little pool, but he wasn't heading toward his mother. He was walking directly toward the fence that separated their properties, the same fence where Karen had been gradually loosening several boards near the ground. The child had something clutched in his small fist. Karen squinted and realized it was one of her koi fische Preiswinning. Butterfly koi worth $3,000 that must have somehow gotten into the Hendersons' yard during the recent flooding from her pool's overflow system. "Tommy, honey, come back here," Sarah called absently, not looking up from her book. But Tommy was fixated on the fence, seemingly unaware of his mother's voice. Karen watched in horror as the 6-year-old dropped to his knees and began pushing. Against the loose boards she'd been sabotaging, within seconds, he'd created an opening large enough to crawl through. Karen's mind raced. If the child came onto her property, if he fell into her pool, she'd always made sure her insurance was bulletproof, but the liability issues could be astronomical. And the publicity would be a nightmare. More importantly, this was her chance. If something happened to the Henderson boy on her property, the family would be forced to move. The neighborhood would rally around her as the victim of negligent parenting. She'd finally have her peace and quiet back. All she had to do was nothing. Karen stood frozen, watching as Tommy Henderson squeezed through the gap in the fence, still clutching her expensive fish. The child emerged into her backyard like a trespasser in Eden, his eyes wide with wonder at the pristine landscape before him. "Pretty," Tommy whispered, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence that Karen had learned to despise. The boy took a step toward the pool, then another. The koi fish writhed weakly in his grasps, still alive, but barely. Tommy seemed to understand that the fish needed water because he began moving faster toward the crystal-clear pool that sparkled like a jewel in the afternoon sun. Karen's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was her moment. She could call out, warn the child away. She could alert his mother. She could do a dozen things to prevent what was about to happen. Instead, she did nothing. Tommy Henderson reached the edge of the pool and knelt down, leaning over the water to place the dying fish back where it belonged. He was a sweet child, Karen realized with a sudden, unwelcome pang of conscience. He was trying to save the fish's life. But as Tommy leaned forward, his foot slipped on the wet limestone. Karen watched in slow motion as the 6-year-old boy tumbled headfirst into the deep end of her pool, the koi fish flying from his grasp to land with a splash beside him. The child couldn't swim. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, Karen stood paralyzed at her sliding glass door, watching Tommy Henderson flail desperately in her pool. His head bobbed above the surface once, twice, then disappeared beneath the crystal-clear water. This was what she'd wanted, wasn't it? This was her solution to the noise problem, the property value issue, the disruption of her perfect life. So why did she feel like she was about to vomit? "Help!" The scream came. From the other side of the fence, Sarah Henderson had finally looked up from her book and realized her son was missing. Tommy, Tommy. Karen heard the frantic footsteps, the sound of Sarah running around her yard, calling her child's name. Any second now, she'd notice the gap in the fence. Any second now, she'd see her son drowning in Karen's pool. And what would Karen say? That she'd been inside and hadn't heard anything? That she'd had no idea the fence was damaged? That the boy had trespassed and she wasn't responsible for what happened on her property? The lies formed themselves in her mind with practiced ease. She'd built her entire life on such carefully constructed deceptions. But as she watched Tommy Henderson sink toward the bottom of her pool, his small arms reaching desperately toward the surface, Karen Whitmore discovered something about herself that she'd never known. She was a coward, but she wasn't a monster. Not yet. Karen dropped her towel and dove into the pool, her designer swimsuit cutting through the water as she swam toward the drowning child. She reached Tommy just as his struggles were beginning to weaken, wrapped her arms around his small body, and kicked hard toward the surface. They broke through together, Tommy gasping and coughing up chlorinated water while Karen held him against her chest, both of them treading water in the middle of her perfect pool. "I've got you," she whispered, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. "You're okay. I've got you." That's when she heard the thunderous crash of breaking wood, followed by the deep, protective bark of an 80-pound German shepherd who'd just broken through her fence to save a child he thought was in danger. Rex hit the water like a furry cannonball, swimming directly toward them with powerful strokes. His intelligent brown eyes locked on Tommy. The dog had come to rescue his boy, unaware that Karen had already done the job. But as Rex reached them, as Karen found herself surrounded by the very chaos she'd spent years trying to eliminate, she realized something that would change everything. The gap in the fence, the one she'd been secretly widening for weeks, was now completely destroyed, leaving a gaping hole that revealed her backyard to the entire neighborhood. And standing in that hole, having witnessed everything, Officer Mike Rodriguez didn't say a word as he helped pull Tommy and Karen from the pool. His silence was more terrifying than any accusation could have been. Rex paddled to the shallow end, shaking himself off before trotting protectively to Tommy's side, his massive body positioned between the child and Karen like a living shield. Tommy! Sarah Henderson burst through the destroyed fence, her face white with terror. She dropped to her knees and gathered her son into her arms, checking every inch of him for injuries. "Oh God, baby, are you okay? What happened?" Tommy nodded. Against his mother's shoulder, still coughing up pool water, "The fishy was sick, Mama. I tried to help it, but I fell in the water. The nice lady saved me." "Nice lady?" Karen's stomach churned at the innocent words. Sarah's tear-filled eyes met hers across the limestone deck, and Karen saw something there that made her want to disappear. Genuine gratitude mixed with confusion. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "I don't know how to God if you hadn't been here. ... Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Officer Rodriguez's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Mrs. Whitmore," his tone was professionally neutral, but his dark eyes missed nothing as they swept over the scene. "Interesting afternoon." "Yes, well, ... Karen wrapped her towel more tightly around herself, acutely aware that she was trembling. "Just glad I could help. I'm sure you are." Rodriguez knelt beside the destroyed fence, examining the splintered wood with the methodical attention of someone who had investigated hundreds of crime scenes. "This damage looks fresh. Is strong. But ... He picked up one of the loose boards, noting the clean knife cuts along its edges. "These look like they were weakened over time." Karen felt the blood drain from her face. I've been meaning to have that repaired. The weather, you know, the wood warps." "Huh." Rodriguez stood, brushing sawdust from his hands. His radio crackled with distant chatter, but he ignored it, his attention fixed entirely on Karen. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you mind if we talked privately for a moment?" It wasn't really a question. Sarah was too focused on Tommy to notice the undercurrent of tension. But Karen caught the protective way Rex positioned himself between the officer and the child. Even the dog sensed something was wrong. "Sarah, why don't you take Tommy inside and get him warmed up?" Rodriguez suggested. "I'll be over in a few minutes to take a statement." "A statement?" Sarah looked confused. "Mike, it was an accident." Tommy wandered off, fell in the pool. Mrs. Whitmore saved him. Rodriguez's eyes never left Karen's face. "Standard procedure. For any incident involving a minor and potential property damage," as Sarah carried Tommy toward the gap in the fence, the boy looked back over his mother's shoulder. "Bye, nice lady. Thank you for saving the fishy too." The coy Karen had completely forgotten about the fish. She looked toward the pool and saw it floating near the surface, its orange and black scales glinting in the sunlight. "Dead. Expensive. Fish," Rodriguez observed, following her gaze. "Yes, the kind of fish that would be worth quite a bit of money, I suppose. The kind of fish someone might be very upset about losing." Karen's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Officer Rodriguez, I don't appreciate what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm investigating." He pulled out a small notebook and pen, the simple actions somehow more intimidating than if he'd drawn a weapon. "Let's start with the fence. How long has it been damaged?" "I told you, the weather. How long?" The repeated question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Karen could lie, but she sensed this man wouldn't be fooled by her usual performance. There was something about him, a quiet intelligence that reminded her uncomfortably of her late father. The only person who'd ever been able to see through her manipulations. "A few weeks," she admitted. "And you didn't think to repair it immediately? With a special needs child living next door." The words hit like physical blows. Karen tried to summon her usual indignation, the righteous anger that had carried her through countless confrontations with neighbors, service workers, and anyone else who dared question her authority. Instead, she felt small, exposed. "Getting estimates," she said weakly. Rodriguez wrote something in his notebook. "Mrs. Whitmore, where were you when Tommy fell into your pool?" "Inside. I heard the splash and came running." "You heard the splash from inside your house?" Karen hesitated. She'd been standing right there watching, but admitting that would raise questions about why she hadn't prevented the accident in the first place. "I was by the sliding door. I have excellent hearing. I see. More notes. And you immediately dove in to rescue him, of course." Without hesitation, the question was asked so casually that Karen almost missed its significance. Almost, "What kind of person do you think I am?" she snapped, her defensive mechanisms finally kicking in. "A child was drowning in my pool. Of course, I saved him immediately." Rodriguez looked up from his notebook, and Karen saw her mistake reflected in his knowing eyes. If she'd acted immediately, Tommy wouldn't have been underwater long enough to nearly drown. If she'd acted immediately, the child wouldn't have been unconscious when she pulled him out. If she'd acted immediately, there wouldn't have been time for Rex to break through the fence. "Mrs. Whitmore," Rodriguez said quietly, "I think we need to continue this conversation at the station. Am I under arrest? Should you be?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Karen felt the carefully constructed walls of her life beginning to crumble, brick by brick. Everything she'd built, everything she'd worked for, balanced. On the edge of this moment, that's when her phone rang. She glanced at the display and felt her blood turn to ice. Miguel, her landscaper, the man she'd called less than an hour ago, demanding he find a way to deal with the Henderson family's noise problem. Rodriguez noticed her reaction. "Aren't you going to answer that?" Karen stared at the phone, watching it ring. If she answered, Miguel might say something incriminating. If she didn't answer, Rodriguez would wonder why. The ringing stopped, then immediately started again. Popular Lady Rodriguez observed. This time, Karen let it go to voicemail. But she could see the calculation in the officer's eyes, the way he was filing away every detail of her behavior. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to need you to come with me to answer some questions. I want a lawyer." The words came out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted them. Innocent people didn't ask for lawyers. Innocent people cooperated fully with police investigations. Rodriguez nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. "That's your right, but I should mention, we'll need to process this scene as part of our investigation. That means your pool area will be off limits until further notice." Karen looked at her pristine backyard, her perfect oasis, and realized it would never be the same. The fence was destroyed. The limestone was stained with pool water and muddy paw prints from Rex. Her expensive koi fish floated dead in the crystal-clear water that had been her pride and joy. But the worst damage wasn't visible to the naked eye. It was the knowledge that everyone would soon know what she'd almost done, what she'd been willing to let happen to an innocent child for the sake of her own convenience. Her phone buzzed. With a text message, Miguel again. Rodriguez glanced at it, persistent. Karen looked down at the screen and felt her world collapse completely. The message read, "Mrs. Whitmore, I found a way to deal with the Henderson problem like you asked. My cousin works for Child Protective Services. One anonymous call about unsafe living conditions, and that family will be gone by next week. Should I make the call?" Rodriguez's eyes met hers across the phone screen, and Karen knew he'd read every word. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "you're under arrest." 3 weeks later, Karen sat in the defendant's chair of Maricopa County Superior Court, barely recognizable as the woman who had once ruled her limestone kingdom. The designer swimwear had been replaced by an ill-fitting gray suit from Walmart, only store that would deliver to someone under house arrest. Her perfectly styled hair hung limp and unwashed, and the Botox had worn off, revealing lines of stress and sleepless nights that aged her a decade. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Karen could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes boring into her back, their hatred a physical force that made her want to curl into herself and disappear. The judge had warned that any outbursts would result in immediate removal. But the silence was somehow worse than shouting would have been. It thrummed with barely contained rage. District Attorney Maria Santos stood at the prosecution table, her posture radiating confidence. She was younger than Karen had expected, maybe 40, with graying temples and eyes that missed nothing. Santos had built her career prosecuting hate crimes and child endangerment cases, and she clearly saw Karen as her white whale. "Your Honor," Santos began her opening statement, "what we have here is not a moment of poor judgment or a tragic accident. What we have is the calculated, systematic targeting of a vulnerable family by a woman who believed her wealth and status placed her above common decency and above the law." Karen's new attorney she'd managed to scrape together enough money for someone with actual experience squeezed her arm in what was meant to be reassurance. Robert Kellerman was a criminal defense specialist, who cost $500 an hour and had made his reputation defending white-collar criminals, but even he seemed overwhelmed by the evidence against her. The state will prove, Santos continued, that Karen Whitmore spent months planning and executing a campaign of terror against the Henderson family, that she deliberately sabotaged the fence separating their properties, that she conspired with others to file false reports with Child Protective Services, and that when 6-year-old Tommy Henderson fell into her pool, she stood and watched for nearly 3 minutes while a child drowned, calculating whether his death would be convenient for her. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Karen closed her eyes, but she could still feel their stares like brands against her skin. Furthermore, Santos said, her voice rising, we will prove that Mrs. Whitmore's actions were motivated by hatred and bigotry, making this not just attempted murder, but a federal hate crime. The words hit Karen like physical blows. Federal hate crime. The phrase would follow her for the rest of her life, branding her as something monstrous in the eyes of history. Ellerman stood for his opening statement, and Karen could see the uphill battle written in every line of his face. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client made mistakes. Serious mistakes. But there's a difference between poor judgment and attempted murder. Karen Whitmore saved Tommy Henderson's life. Whatever her motivations before that moment, when it mattered most, she chose to do the right thing. It was a weak defense, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The prosecution's case unfolded over the next week like a masterclass in methodical destruction. Security footage showed Karen systematically weakening the fence boards. Phone records revealed her increasingly desperate calls to city officials, the Homeowners Association, and anyone else who might help her remove the Henderson family. Text messages with Miguel exposed the conspiracy to file false CPS reports, but the most damning evidence came from Karen's own neighbors. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, an 80-year-old retiree who lived across the street, testified that Karen had approached her multiple times asking her to file noise complaints against the Hendersons. She said that boy wasn't normal, that he didn't belong in our neighborhood. She used words I won't repeat in court about his condition. James Morrison, who lived 2 houses down, described Karen's behavior at Homeowners Association meetings. She was obsessed with getting rid of that family. She'd bring it up at every meeting, no matter what was on the agenda. She called Tommy a defective child and said his parents were negligent for not keeping him locked up. The words hung in the courtroom air like toxic fumes. Karen wanted to object, to explain that she'd been frustrated that people were taking her comments out of context. But she knew how it sounded. She knew how she sounded. The worst moment came when Sarah Henderson took the stand. Tommy's mother had aged visibly in the weeks since the incident. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her hands shook as she was sworn in. But her voice was steady as she described months of harassment that Karen had somehow convinced herself were justified. She would stand at her fence and stare at Tommy while he played, Sarah testified. At first I thought she was just curious about his behavior. A lot of people don't understand autism. But then she started making comments, loud comments meant for us to hear, about how some children shouldn't be allowed in public, about how parents like us were selfish for inflicting our problems on others. Karen remembered those comments. At the time, they'd felt like reasonable observations about public decency and property values. Hearing them repeated in a court of law, she realized how they must have sounded to a mother trying to protect her child. The fence, Santos prompted gently. She told me the fence needed repairs, that it was a safety hazard. But every time we offered to split the cost, she found excuses to delay. Then I started noticing that the damage seemed to be getting worse, not better. Boards that were solid one day would be loose the next. Sarah's voice broke slightly. I was worried about Tommy, but I thought she was just ... I never imagined she was doing it deliberately. Mrs. Henderson, can you describe the day of the incident? Sarah took a shuddering breath. Tommy had been playing in his little pool. He saw one of Mrs. Whitmore's koi fishnet must have gotten into our yard somehow during the flooding last month. He's very empathetic, especially with animals. When he saw it was struggling, he wanted to help. And then I was reading, and I looked up, and he was gone. Just gone. I started searching everywhere, calling his name. Then I heard Rex barking, but it wasn't his normal bark. It was ... frantic, desperate. That's when I knew something was wrong. Santos pulled out a photograph, still framed from the Hendersons' security camera. "Mrs. Henderson, can you identify what's happening in this image?" Sarah looked at the photo and began to cry. It showed Rex, the German Shepherd, hurling himself against the fence with such force that the wooden boards were splintering around him. His eyes were wild with panic, his mouth open in a bark of pure desperation. He knew, Sarah whispered. Rex knew Tommy was in trouble, and he was trying to get to him. But the fence, Mrs. Whitmore had weakened it so much that Rex could break through, but it took time, precious time. How much time? The time stamp shows Rex starting to break through at 2:47. He reached Tommy at 2:50. 3 minutes. Sarah looked directly at Karen for the first time since taking the stand. 3 minutes. My son was drowning while she stood there and watched. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. The judge gavelled for order, but Karen could feel the hatred radiating from the gallery like heat from a furnace. "Mrs. Henderson," Santos continued, "when you arrived at the pool, what did you see?" Mrs. Whitmore was in the water with Tommy, but he was unconscious. Rex was swimming in circles around them, whimpering. If that dog hadn't broken through the fence, Sarah's voice broke completely. My son would be dead. During cross-examination, Kellerman tried to establish that Karen had ultimately saved Tommy's life, that her actions in the crucial moment proved she wasn't a monster, but his questions only made things worse. "Mrs. Henderson, you've testified that Mrs. Whitmore pulled your son from the pool, correct?" "Yes." "And she administered CPR?" "Yes." "She saved his life." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the careful thought of someone who'd been asked it many times. Mrs. Whitmore pulled Tommy out of the water, but she didn't save his life. "I'm sorry, Rex saved his life. If that dog hadn't alerted me that something was wrong, if he hadn't broken through the fence, if he hadn't been there to make sure Mrs. Whitmore couldn't just walk away, Sarah's voice gained strength as she spoke. A dog showed more humanity than she did. The words landed like a physical blow. Karen felt the truth of them settle into her bones, heavy and inescapable. A German Shepherd animal, acting on pure instinct, had shown more compassion and courage than she had. That night, alone in her house, with only an ankle monitor for company, Karen stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw a stranger. The woman looking back at her had hollow eyes and hollow cheeks, as if something essential had been carved out of her and thrown away. Her phone buzzed with another death threat. They came hourly now, from strangers around the world who'd seen her story and decided she represented everything wrong with humanity. The police said they were investigating, but Karen could tell their hearts weren't in it. Why protect someone? Who wouldn't protect a drowning child? She wandered through her empty house. The maid service had quit. The pool maintenance company had dropped her. Even her grocery delivery service had canceled her account. The limestone floors that had once seemed so elegant now felt cold. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Karen knew this because she counted every minute, watching the clock on the courtroom wall tick away what might be her last moments of freedom for decades. 6 hours to decide whether she was a monster or merely a woman who'd made terrible mistakes. 6 hours to weigh evidence against character, intent against action, privilege against justice. When the bailiff called them back into session, Karen's legs nearly gave out. Kellerman steadied her with a firm grip on her elbow, but even he looked pale beneath his expensive tan. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Patricia Hawkins asked. The jury foreman, a middle-aged construction worker named Frank Delgado, stood slowly. He'd been taking notes throughout the trial, his weathered hands moving carefully across the pages as if he understood the weight of every word. Now those same hands held a piece of paper that would determine Karen's fate. "We have, Your Honor, on the charge of attempted murder in the first degree. How do you find?" Karen's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst. Around her, the packed courtroom held its collective breath. "We find the defendant, not guilty." A gasp rippled through the gallery, followed immediately by angry murmurs. Karen felt a momentary surge of relief, but Delgado wasn't finished. "On the charge of reckless endangerment of a minor, how do you find guilty?" "On the charge of criminal conspiracy, how do you find guilty?" "On the federal charge of committing a hate crime against a person with disabilities, how do you find?" Delgado looked directly at Karen, and she saw something in his eyes that chilled her more than any guilty verdict could. Not hatred, but disappointment so profound it seemed to reach into her soul and find it wanting. Guilty. The courtroom exploded. Shouts of approval mixed with cries of outrage that the attempted murder charge hadn't stuck. Karen felt strangely disconnected from the chaos around her. Guilty on the federal hate crime charge meant 20 years minimum. Guilty on the conspiracy charge added another 10. Even with good behavior, she'd be in her 70s before she saw freedom again. The court will reconvene in 2 weeks for sentencing, Judge Hawkins announced over the din. The defendant will remain in custody pending that hearing. Most faces were twisted with satisfaction or rage, but in the back row, she spotted someone. Unexpected, Tommy Henderson, sitting beside his mother with Rex lying at his feet. As their gazes met, Tommy did something that broke what was left of Karen's heart. He smiled, not a cruel smile, not a mocking expression. Of victory. It was the same innocent, forgiving smile he'd given her in the pool when he'd thanked her for saving him. The smile of a child who still believed people could be good, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Karen tried to smile back, but the tears came instead. She was still crying when they led her away. 2 weeks later, the sentencing hearing drew even larger crowds. National media had set up camp outside the courthouse, turning the proceedings into a circus of cameras and commentary. Karen had become a symbol of privilege unchecked, of the cruelty that could lurk beneath suburban respectability, of what happened when someone finally faced consequences for their actions. The victim. Impact statements were brutal. Sarah Henderson spoke for 20 minutes about the lasting trauma her family had endured. Tommy now woke up screaming from nightmares about drowning. He was afraid to go near any body of water, including the bathtub. The family had spent thousands on therapy, and Sarah had quit her job to care for her son full-time. "My child will," Sarah said, her voice steady but her hands shaking. "But what haunts me most is knowing how close we came to losing him entirely. Not to an accident, not to his disability, but to the calculated cruelty of someone who saw him as less than human." Other neighbors spoke about the climate of fear Karen had created in their community. The anonymous complaints that had targeted anyone who didn't meet her standards, the verbal harassment of service workers, the way she'd made people afraid to let their children play in their own backyards. But the most devastating statement came from an unexpected source, Miguel Santos, the landscaper who'd helped her conspiracy. "I want everyone to understand," Miguel said, his accent thick with emotion. "Mrs. Whitmore didn't just ask me to file false reports about the Henderson family. She offered to pay my daughter's college tuition if I could find a way to get them arrested. She wanted me to plant drugs in their garbage. She wanted me to call immigration on Sarah Henderson's babysitter, even though the girl was born in Phoenix." Miguel looked directly at Karen as he spoke, and she saw her own reflection in his eyes. A woman so consumed with hatred that she'd tried to turn others into instruments of her cruelty. "I said no to all of it," Miguel continued, "but I should have said no to everything. I should have called the police the first time she asked me to hurt that family. I will regret my silence for the rest of my life." When it came time for Karen to speak on her own behalf, she stood on unsteady legs and faced the courtroom. She'd prepared a statement, carefully crafted by Kellerman to express remorse while avoiding further legal liability. But looking out at the sea of faces, some angry, some satisfied. "I don't know how to explain what I became," she said instead, her voice barely audible in the large room. "I spent so many years building walls around myself, literal walls, emotional walls, walls of money and status and control." She paused, looking for Tommy in the crowd. She found him in the front row now, sitting between his mother and Rex, watching her with that same direct gaze that seemed to see everything. "But the truth is, I was just afraid. Afraid that if I let any chaos into my perfect world, it would all fall apart." Karen's voice grew stronger, though tears streamed down her face. "So I decided he was the problem. Not me, never me. I convinced myself that a 6-year-old boy was my enemy." The courtroom was silent now, hanging on her every word. "When Tommy fell into my pool, I had a choice. I could save an innocent child, or I could protect my perfect life. For 3 minutes, 3 minutes that will haunt me forever, I chose my perfect life. I chose my comfort over a child's existence." Karen looked directly at Tommy as she spoke the next words. I am sorry. I am so profoundly sorry that no amount of time in prison will ever be enough penance for what I almost did." She sat down heavily, feeling as though she'd aged decades in the space of a few minutes. Judge Hawkins reviewed the sentencing guidelines. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of absolute judgment. "Mrs. Whitmore, you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the very heart of what we value as a society: the protection of children, the acceptance of differences, and the basic human decency that prevents us from becoming monsters." The judge paused, letting the words settle. "The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Karen closed her eyes, feeling the number settle into her bones. 25 years. She'd be 68 when she got out, if she lived that long. Her business would be gone, her house sold to pay legal fees and victim restitution. Everything she'd spent her life building would be ash. But as the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Karen realized something that surprised her. The crushing weight she'd carried for weeks, the weight of guilt and shame and self-loathing, had lifted. Slightly, not disappeared, never that, but shifted into something she could actually carry. For the first time in her life, she was facing real consequences for her actions. For the first time in her life, she couldn't buy or manipulate or charm her way out of the mess she'd made. For the first time in her life, she was being held accountable. As they led her toward the door that would take her to the rest of her life, Karen heard a small voice call out from the gallery, "Bye, nice lady." She turned and saw Tommy Henderson waving at her, his expression serious but not unkind. Rex sat beside him, tongue lolling out in what could almost be interpreted as a canine smile. Karen waved back, and for just a moment, she glimpsed what she might have been if she'd chosen differently. If she'd seen Tommy as a child instead of a problem, if she'd offered help instead of harassment, if she'd built bridges instead of walls, but that woman was gone now, lost in the limestone ruins of a kingdom built on cruelty and maintained by fear. All that remained was Karen Whitmore, federal prisoner, who would spend the next quarter-century learning what it meant to be human in a world where privilege couldn't protect her from the consequences of her choices. The handcuffs clicked shut, with a sound like closing doors. And Karen Whitmore walked toward whatever justice looked like for someone who'd almost become a monster but had been saved by a dog.